And I'll start with a brief intro as people are coming in and joining us. We're very fortunate to have Michelle and Nick here with us today, both of whom are people I consider to be journalism innovators, people who are actually making a difference in terms of creating products and services for the journalism world. In Nick's case, he's co-founder and CEO of Pico, which is a really exciting platform that people are able to use to monetize the work that they're doing. So it's supporting the journalism as a kind of infrastructure component, and in some other ways helping people build community, which Nick can tell us about further. And Michelle is a co-founder and CEO of Untapped Cities and Untapped New York, and has built a really exciting kind of travel vertical, travel site, travel company in a really new and interesting way, which she'll tell us about. And they have all sorts of great credentials and backgrounds, which I'm sure most people attending have read about. But the point is that they are now creating really great, impactful products, and they have an interesting perspective on platforms and tools for micro ventures, people who are creating their own independent news ventures of various kinds. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And this is the last in the series that we've had this year of these events, these discussions. We're going to pause after this until the fall. But this is a really great topic to end with, looking at the platforms and tools for micro ventures. So having said that, I'm going to jump right in and invite both Michelle and Nick to tell us a little bit about how they've been coping with the pandemic in terms of addressing the changing landscape that we're facing now, and what are some of the things that they've been doing to adapt to that. Michelle, maybe you want to start us off with yours, which was really heavily event-based. So this really did affect you, I think, in particular.
Yeah, sure. So for those who may not be familiar, Untapped New York is both an online magazine, but also an experience company. So we run tours for the public, private tours for groups, and also we have a membership club called Untapped New York Insiders, which is also an event-based organization. And so the pandemic was a real drastic, quick shift. I feel like it feels like overnight, but actually, it kind of slowly came in waves. So we were reacting as the news was coming out regarding reducing our the size of our groups, and then finally saying, no, we're shut down. So I would say there was a few weeks of like reacting, sending out communications, and then thinking about what we were going to do next in a world where we couldn't gather in person. And so we thought about who were our main clientele that we needed to cater to, which was our members, and decided to launch a very robust programming of virtual events. So we turned a lot of our tours into talks. We had organizations we often work with give talks. We did live tours with stabilizers around New York City in areas that our tour guides felt comfortable doing. And then we thought about how we were going to grow this membership and what messaging we wanted to convey at this time. It felt like a strange thing to ask people to pay more in a crisis mode. And so we wanted to figure out a way to give back to New York and New Yorkers. And so we offered 2 months free of our membership. And that has been super interesting in terms of seeing the growth of the membership. So we doubled the number of members during this time, gained a lot of new people. And I think one of the most exciting things is through a virtual offering, we're able to reach people around the country who are diehard New Yorkers, but don't live here anymore. And also around the world. So we have people joining us at all our events from Europe, from California, from everywhere. And so that was one of the biggest learnings. Kind of, we had thought of our audience as in-person physically in New York. And that really opened it up. And of course, we had to deal with a lot of applying for the government grants, which I think I gained like 10 white hairs from the whole PPP process, and then adapting our editorial content, which has been actually exciting for me. So we can talk about all of that more and some of the new ventures we're starting to launch as well.
That's great. Thanks, Michelle. Nick?
Well, thanks for having me, Jeremy. And I agree with Michelle. Definitely some new white hairs going through the PPP process. Oh boy. Yeah, it feels like it's been about a decade. But it's an interesting time for the journalism industry. Obviously, a lot of challenges reporting, like doing the field work now. But on our side, I can say that it's also very encouraging. You know, we're seeing memberships jump a lot. So we're feeling very motivated at Pico. And for those who aren't familiar with what we're doing, we're building sign up and payment tools for digital newsrooms. And you can actually even come to Pico without a website. You know, you can start with a landing page and start collecting newsletter signups, start collecting payments even. So that's the gist of what our software does. To be perfectly frank, you know, most of the tools that were needed for this pandemic, we had already built. They were already being used. So there was no real product crisis to speak of when things hit. Our system just scaled as it needed to. So didn't break a sweat on that front. But what was interesting was, you know, we were starting to see you know, for the last couple of years, we've been serving primarily newsrooms, small newsrooms, independent journalists. We started seeing yoga studios come onto our platform, non-journalist customers trying out Pico. I thought, oh, that's interesting. But I guess this is kind of the blending of content media, whatever you want to call it, this feeling of being a member, right? I think if you're a loyal reader of a newspaper, you are a member of that publication. The same way you might be a member of a yoga studio in your neighborhood. So that was an interesting aha moment for us. And we built some new features for these new types of customers, like day passes, week passes, that didn't really come up before for newsrooms. But yeah, so it's been an interesting time, filled with some PPP paperwork as well.
Maybe you can both talk a little bit about the various options that are out there in terms of platforms, because, you know, if you're a journalist or really anyone, you mentioned other people creating content, it's not just journalists. If you're creating content out there now, you have so many different options, from creating a newsletter on Substack or MailChimp to creating podcasts on Anchor to creating a Facebook group to creating a Medium publication and so on and so forth, and creating your own sites, obviously with WordPress and all sorts of other options, including even you know, creating your own text messaging service right now. So there's all sorts of different options. Would you share your perspectives on that, Michelle, from the perspective of someone who created your own site, your own brand, your company, and Nick, from the perspective of someone who sees people creating, you know, all these different products and whose product integrates with those? Michelle, maybe you want to start?
Yeah. And so I started this in 2009. I guess that was probably the last major crisis the world or the country saw. I had left my job a few years ago, so I was kind of like doing a lot of different things, teaching, being in a band, you know, and that's kind of when I was inspired to create Untapped New York. And I still strongly believe in like really teaching yourself the tools so that you know how they're done, because then when you do have to hire someone later, you understand like the mechanics of it and how much effort something might take and how much you should pay. And so my experience was very DIY at the beginning. I created a WordPress site. I had friends help me, like, how do I connect a domain to a site and what's hosting? And so I learned all of that. And I think all of that information still is really relevant when I work with an agency today who developed our latest website, and taught myself some HTML and also, and I mean, I guess I'm interested in that also, the mechanics of how something works. I also think like the tools that enable lots of APIs to communicate with a platform are really something to look for if you're like trying to build something. So you want whatever platform you're using to be able to communicate with anything you might want to plug in, so that you don't have to build everything yourself. So just to give an example, like WordPress is like open source, so it has a lot of plugins that you can add. It has some negatives, like right now it looks kind of ancient compared to like maybe Squarespace that's much newer, but it is also very powerful front and back end. So it really depends on, am I creating something simple where it's just, you know, the site that I picked, the theme looks great and that's all I'm going to need, or am I going to be building lots of things on top of it? And so kind of establishing what your needs are and then what platforms to use. But I agree, there's tons of stuff out there. I think one of the dangers is don't go for like the latest it thing necessarily. So there's always like a new social media platform. Like, do I need to be on TikTok? Does my brand need to be on TikTok? But there's like a limit to how much you can manage as your own brand. And you might have your brand sites, but also your like personal. So it gets like really overwhelming. So kind of like focus in and build from there.
Yeah, I want to come back to that question about managing your own brand versus your brand later on. I remember Yo. Remember Yo? That was like a thing for a minute. Everyone wanted to have a Yo account.
Oh my
anyway,
God, I missed it.
Yeah, that was a quick moment before Peach and somewhere in there. Nick, do you want to jump in on this one about platforms and what you've seen about people creating different kinds of products with Pico? And
Sure, yeah. And by the way, I think they raised $8 million at the time, something like that. And we all thought it was ridiculous. Things have changed. Yeah, I totally agree with Michelle on all of her points. I would, if I were a recent, J school grad and thinking about starting something, I would think a lot about platform lock-in. I would say that most options out there for digital media are pretty, I don't want to oversimplify it, but they're pretty simple to set up. They're mostly no code tools. You don't need to hire a developer. So the difference between, Patreon, Substack versus WordPress, like what Michelle was talking about, it's actually not that huge of a gulf. But the path you choose, these are two very, very different paths. So the question is whether you want to really create your own brand, or if you want to, hitch a ride on some platform that is getting a lot of attention. And for example, right now, Substack getting a lot of attention. They're great, by the way. I love those guys. They've made a great product. Just recognize that is a very different product experience from building your own brand with a website. These are both valid options, but very different paths that you should think about very carefully before building up your audience. Because once you do build up that audience, if you have 10,000 subscribers on a Substack newsletter, and then you think, oh, I've hit my ceiling with what this platform can do. I want my own website. I want to extend it in all these different ways. So imagine yourself being very successful, because you will be, and then think about what kind of tools you'll need in that situation.
I think that's a great insight and important for people to think about. Often when you're beginning, right, you're just sort of wanting to get to step one or step two. And so it's much easier, right, to use an existing platform that basically does the heavy lifting for you, because you're not thinking about that moment, 3 years from now when you have 10,000 subscribers. And frankly, many people won't get to that point in many cases if it's a side project, or they won't necessarily. So in terms of, let's say you do want to go the road of kind of doing it yourself, right, which is kind of what you're hinting at, I think. What are some tips you have on doing that if you don't have a lot of technical expertise, or if you don't have a huge amount of bandwidth to train yourself from scratch to code, or et cetera? How would you see that process, both of you? And Nick, do you want to start since you were on that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, quick little plug here. We actually launched a blog last year called The Byline, as an offshoot of the Pico brand. And we set it up because we were getting these questions a lot from new journalism entrepreneurs. And we realized we were, giving the same answers over and over. And we also happen to know a lot of people in the industry who knew way more than us about this stuff. And we invited them to write some guest posts. So if you go to The Byline, you'll find a lot of articles that touch on precisely this, the process of launching a new brand. I would say, if WordPress being an example, if you're in the process of picking a CMS, make sure you're picking one that is open to plugins, like Michelle was talking about. That is one huge drawback of Squarespace, by the way. We've seen some people come to us with Squarespace websites, and they're like, okay, now I want to do this and that and that. And we're like, oh, well, you're in a walled garden. So make sure you're picking a CMS that can support plugins and is extensible in that sense. And I think what is increasingly important, pick one that has a strong customer community around it. because while we can do as much as we can to help, and there are plenty of other resources out there, you can always hire a dev shop. These days, the best platforms allow you to find an answer from other customers. And I think Webflow is a great example of that. We actually rebuilt our marketing site and the byline, our blog, on Webflow earlier this year, because we were really curious about the platform. We wanted to try it out, see if Pico could work with it. It does. And it's just a fantastic CMS. Very different from WordPress, but I would give it high marks for that customer community that they've built up.
So yeah, I totally agree with that as well. I mean, I think the number of times I've started to just Google something and ended up on the message board of a company, whether it's WordPress or something else. And then I think finding really good partners for your stuff. So like we host on something called WP Engine, and their customer service is like super robust. And so a lot of the questions where before I might have had to pay a developer the X number of hours it would have taken, they actually can help you with that stuff. So, so kind of seeing like, before we were like really cheap and used like GoDaddy for hosting and everything was always going down. And then I pay more, but then I basically have a technical person that can answer. The other thing that I really love doing is just like consulting my network of friends and the hive mind, I guess. I think all of like the really, really great partners I've ended up working with that really helped us solve some major problem we were having came through recommendations through other people. And so like when we needed to figure out how to best advertise our site, then we got a freelancer who was great. And then another publication suggested a company called Publier that monetizes our site and has developed a lot of new tools for us. So, so yeah, like looking into what your network already entails and asking questions out of the blue, and you kind of never know. That was super helpful, especially in the early stages.
What about the platforms that offer to help people kind of get crowdfunding, get going started? Patreon is one that people have used in a variety of ways. Kickstarter, obviously, GoFundMe, those kinds of things. Obviously, to your point earlier, Nick, you're to some extent potentially locking in some of the info into those platforms, right? Is there a way around that? I mean, some people do find that that's helpful getting some initial funding. What are your thoughts on that? And Michelle, I don't know if you have thoughts on that as well.
Kickstarter is great. The concept of it, to crowdfund. And actually, two of our most successful customers, Block Club Chicago and the Colorado Sun, I'm not sure the Colorado Sun did this. I think it was just Block Club Chicago. They launched on Kickstarter. They raised quite a bit of money. Big problem though, when you then take those backers, I think they call them, and try to migrate them over to your ultimate product offering. Typically, and look, Kickstarter wasn't built for this scenario we're talking about. It was built for these one-off projects, a product that you buy, right? It's much more straightforward. I'm going to spend $100 and then it's shipped to me, half a year later. Here we're talking about backing a newsroom that then converts into a recurring membership, a monthly membership. That's a lot harder. And what we found in those transitions, Block Club being one of them, was that a lot of the Kickstarter backers, they didn't realize that not all of this stuff just talked to each other automatically. They thought, oh, well, I have a Kickstarter account, so I should be able to log into your site and it should recognize my membership. I can tell you now, it's not the case. It's very hard to migrate that information over. So that's the negative. Unfortunately, and more negative, I'm not sure there's a better alternative right now for crowdfunding. We at Pico have been thinking about this a lot, and we are trying really hard to clear space in our roadmap to build a very simple version of Kickstarter. Basically, don't charge anyone until we reach a certain fundraise threshold. And then that's when everyone's monthly subscription starts. Great idea. We don't have much time, but we're going to try to build it at some point. Until then, I don't have a good answer for it. But once we do have that's an easy way to make sure that it's in your Stripe account and under your control, and it's more portable.
And I guess Patreon has a similar issue of lock-in, I guess, potentially for some people.
Yeah. With Patreon, Kickstarter, Substack, you don't. Actually, I take that back on Substack. I don't think that's the case there. But
Stuff you can export.
yeah, Substack you can't export. But with some of these other platforms, they manage your finances basically. It's one big pool of money across this creator platform, which makes it very difficult to migrate to your own Stripe account where you have full control over those finances.
Michelle, do you have any experience with those kinds of platforms, or did you consider them?
They weren't around when I started, and sometimes maybe in the mid stage of what we were doing, people would suggest like, why don't you do stuff on Kickstarter or something? And sometimes I look back and I'm like, would have made the going at it a little bit easier had we been able to fundraise. But at the same time, I think we went for always thinking, what kind of products can we provide to the audience that will be that we can possibly monetize. And I think by doing that, we did create a lot of brand loyalty for our products, but it's also very labor intensive. So it kind of depends on how long you want to rough it out. And but I also really agree with what Nick is saying about trying to control or have control of the information from your readers or the backers. And Stripe, a lot of platforms do communicate with Stripe, and therefore you are the ones that hold the account to that data. And so if you want to migrate that information, it's easier. And I think that's really important. I think that applies to a lot of the other platforms. For example, when we first started, Facebook was driving a lot of traffic to different sites, right? This is before they even monetized. And then they started creating the news feed, and then they started creating the algorithm and more and more if you had a Facebook page of 40,000, 100,000, only like a small percentage would see your posts. And so we realized over time that all these platforms that are like kind of this wonderful thing in terms of like driving your audience, building your audience at first, over time lose their efficacy. And then you feel like, oh, how do I reach those customers again? So we then really focus on building our newsletter. That way we can control who our audience is and we can contact them directly. So that's sort of been our strategy for almost everything after kind of having this realization is, how do we control our distribution methods?
What are both of your outlooks, for the coming years? Michelle, this is your main thing, right? This is your main focus. And so, when you look a couple of years out, as the pandemic, obviously we don't know where that's heading and how that will change in the coming year. But what's your sense about the growth in terms of market opportunities for you, revenue opportunities, sustainability? And Nick, you have investment from Stripe and from Bloomberg Beta, like some big investors have invested in you, and you're building a company that really focuses on small and niche ventures to a large extent, like you mentioned Block Club Chicago and the Colorado Sun. So I'm just wondering what your outlook is. Where do you see the growth coming from in terms of new revenue, new sustainability? Do you see there emerging a lot of new small ventures like this? Do you think the ones that exist are going to grow significantly? Just want to hear your kind of outlook. Michelle, do you want to start with your own?
Sure. I think the future of traditional news is sad for me to see, I think, or to project. I think it's so important, but it's just like for many years now, we've seen that the financial model of online advertising, it just doesn't work. I mean, maybe I'll explain for everyone out there that for every 1,000 page views that an article gets, it makes at best like $4, $5. So you can imagine the number of page views that you need, and that's with multiple ads, not just one ad slot, the whole page that's loading ads. So you can imagine the number of views that needs to be created to, finance one salary. And so it's really difficult for small publications to scale to that and keep their mission of whatever they're doing. But I do think what we've been doing in the last 5, 6, 7 years is really thinking about diversifying. And if you look at the New York Times, for example, they're extremely diversified, right? They have a wine club, they have travel. And I think that's where it's going. And I think what we experienced in the pandemic was like, thank God we had a membership. that we could cater to. Our ads kept going, but the ad market collapsed at the beginning of the pandemic. It's coming back. But every company slashed their budgets, right? And so the ad market collapses for a bit and then comes back. But if we had not had the membership, I'm not quite sure where we would be right now. So I think, I remember I learned that in consulting interviews in college about like diversifying your business, and it like really hit me when this pandemic happened. I was like, thank goodness.
Nick?
Well, actually, Jeremy, I wish you could be with me in investor pitches and give me that softball. That's great. That's that's what I've been trying to explain to folks for a number of years, and I'm glad Stripe and Bloomberg listen. But absolutely, I think this is an excellent moment for small niche newsrooms, media companies to flourish, and the pandemic is probably accelerating that change. This is why we started our company. We were looking at very high-level meta trends, and we thought this was inevitable. Because exactly to Michelle's point, the ad dollars are really not flowing through to the creators anymore. Instead, they're going to the platform owners, Facebook and Google. So if you're left without ad revenue, what do you do? And when you think about memberships for the New York Times, they boast millions of them. A lot of them are actually for cooking, for the crossword puzzle. Michelle was saying they're diversified, and yeah, they've created all these verticals to really go after these specific narrow interests. And that's why I think the future, which is going to be membership driven because of the ad situation, the future is going to be niche because of that. It's really hard to sell a membership to a really broad brand. Unless you're a well-known national paper, that's really not in the cards. So your best bet is to focus on a specific vertical, perhaps even in a specific geography. It can be that, I mean, one of our favorite customers, we don't have favorites, but one of our favorite customers is Boise Dev. It's a really small team, and they write about real estate development, commercial development in Boise, Idaho. Not the biggest of cities, but that's a business. That Boise Dev has turned into a legitimate business, and I think you're going to find those in every city around the country, big and small.
What can you tell us, Nick, from some of the businesses that you've worked with? You mentioned a few so far: Boise Dev, Colorado Sun, Block Club Chicago. What have you learned in terms of pricing strategy, in terms of growth trajectory? How quickly can they grow? How long should they expect to take? Other people out there are thinking about this kind of approach. What are some of the numbers in terms of growth, and what does the pricing look like from your perspective? And how does the pandemic change that, or does it?
Yeah, good question. And I can't promise that, this is just my opinion, right? We're not at the point yet where we can write a white paper on this kind of stuff. I do think, I'll answer your last question first. I think the pandemic is actually opening up wallets a bit more. This is just my personal opinion again, but I feel like people are starting to value memberships and services a bit more when they're stuck at home. Life is a bit less material, it's a bit less experiential. When it's just us and our screens, suddenly, yeah, okay, $10 a month to some new site doesn't seem so unreasonable. I mean, we saw the uptick in memberships, so that leads me to believe that's the case. We'll see what it's like in a few more months. In general, I think businesses in this sector price too low. We've seen memberships in our customer base go as low as $5 a month. And sure, yeah, a lot of people will gladly pay $5 a month, but What about $10 a month? Yes, you might lose some subscribers, but not half. And so I think we should be thinking Netflix plus, or maybe HBO even, right? I think HBO is 15 a month. That seems to be a good sweet spot for a lot of people. And yes, there eventually may be too many subscriptions for people to consider, but we're not even close to that ceiling yet. Every time people talk about a ceiling, we seem to shatter it and move on to the next ceiling. I mean, your rent is a subscription. We're all used to the subscription economy. We're not going to get sick of it. This is how we live. So I think there's a lot of untapped potential still. Untapped. Hey, there you go.
I agree with you on those points too. When we started our membership, we looked at the price of Netflix, which was, I think the lowest level was like $7.99 or $8.99. And we thought, what, in terms of the millennial population, what are they willing to spend? I think we also underpriced because we offered in-person experiences, probably like at least two a week for $10 a month. Because we were like, we want this to be a no-brainer that people will immediately sign up. And now I think we do agree that, well, actually Netflix went up the price, and I think the value that people get are higher. I also agree that people are opening up their wallets. So one of the things we tested was for our guides that couldn't work, if they gave talks, we asked the members to donate. And we discovered that the levels of donation were very high, and people were willing to give $20, $40 for like a 1-hour event. And then in an A/B test that we did inadvertently, we had a filmmaker who wanted to screen his this amazing documentary called Backwater, and he wanted to charge $5 for anyone who wanted to come. You know, the bookings came in slowly, and I think the Monday before the event, which was on Thursday, I said, hey, why don't we make this donation based, minimum $1, and see what happens. And like, bookings skyrocketed. People again were giving $20, $40, much more than he had imagined that he was going to get, or what he thought the value of an hour-and-a-half long documentary was going to be. So that was great because we got to see exactly how the customer psychology is.
So those of you who are here today want to share a question. There's a question here in the Q&A. Please feel free to add yours. We've got about 10 minutes or so left, and we'll take a couple more of those. One question here in the Q&A from Hannah, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, is about, she's interested in the college publication market, and those publications trying to transfer over to this new era. Young people may not have the bandwidth to pay or wallet to pay. Any quick thoughts for Hannah on that question?
Yeah, actually, you know, Michelle mentioned donations. That is a very successful model for a number of our customers. Actually, not everyone has to do recurring memberships, subscriptions, and if you set up a donation CTA, click to action button banner on your website, you can actually drive a lot of clicks that way, and you might even be able to use that to get donations not just from the students but from members of the surrounding community, from the students' parents. Especially since students are only there for 4 years or even less, the idea of a recurring subscription there may be a lot of mental friction there. So I think really trying to go after one-time donations and thinking about pledge drives, that could be a really good model for student papers, I think.
Yeah, we 2 weeks ago added a new widget that's on the bottom of the article, so somewhat visible, not as we could do better, I think. But we started trying out like a donation widget that says like what you see, advertising doesn't sustain publication, etc. And amazingly, people did give. And again, I think the average is $20. And so, yeah, I agree. And then maybe thinking about what other kind of products you could potentially offer as part of a membership that might not cost a lot. So maybe it's like have a Zoom meeting with the founder of the publication or the writers, or kind of get creative about what you can offer.
And by the way, The Guardian basically has this kind of model. They don't paywall content, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned the Colorado Sun earlier. One of our best performing customers, they don't paywall any content. So just having a donation ask, like what Michelle's doing now, it can be really effective.
About bundling, there's discussion of how people, you already we're used to cable bundles, and to some extent, Spotify is a bundle, right? And what do you think about that for niche ventures? I saw a newsletter bundle recently, where there's several sort of newsletter stars are kind of bundling their stuff together. Nick, have you seen an interest in that? Do you think, organizations, if you have a, Block Club Chicago wants to partner with a local Chicago podcasts, et cetera, do you think there's an opportunity for that? Does Pico, enable people to do that? Do you see a growth opportunity in that arena?
Yes. Just not in the next 6 months, but it's been on our minds for a long time. We're just waiting for our customer base to have enough overlap where that makes sense. But right now, we've got, you can have Chicago, Denver, and then a website about real estate tech, and one about electric cars, and one about cooking. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe we can put together a very interesting bundle there, for one person. But yeah, we're not quite at the point of overlap where we can offer those bundles, but it's a good idea.
Michelle, have you done a lot of partnerships, kind of collaboration stuff to extend the audience? Have you found that to be a useful, bartering mentions in different publications and stuff like that, or other kinds of partnerships? Have you found those to be useful?
So at the beginning, when I created it, I would just, have an article that I thought was cool and newsworthy, and just like email Gothamist or Curb, be like, I have this cool discovery. There were a lot of publications back then, and there was a lot of like friendly kind of interactions between them. And so that was a really supportive group, really to get the word out about who we were. And it was great. Within like, a year, I had like a New York Times mention. I had, Atlantic, and all these kind of things that I was really surprised by and really heartened by. I think in terms of long-term kind of business building partnerships, I found them a little bit harder to do. There was a period of like, people wanted to do giveaways together, for example, to collect newsletter emails. So we did some of those, but then you have to make sure that it's like the right product offering. Otherwise it feels weird putting up something to your whole newsletter database. And so kind of over time, I steered a little bit away from that. I'm trying to think if there's any other kind of very fruitful partnerships that. Oh, Jeremy, you're muted.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Since we're talking about platforms and tools, I want to make sure we give you a chance to share any particular favorites that you have. Are there any platforms or tools that you think are underappreciated or underrated, or ones that you personally end up, relying on for either creating content, distributing content, monetizing content? Michelle, any things that you have found like, hey, this has been I'm so glad to have this particular platform or tool? And Nick, anything that supports the creators that you work with, or you yourself as an organization? You mentioned Webflow earlier. Just want to give you a chance to mention any others that you particularly like, because people might benefit from those.
Well, from a creator standpoint, I'm really glad that I had to learn the Adobe Creative Suite when I was in grad school for architecture. I actually use it every day, for photo editing, for making diagrams, for making graphics. And so I highly recommend, kind of mastering the tools of creation, including photography, and being able to put out a professional looking product. And there's like a student version of Photoshop that's $9.99. So a lot of these tools are not very expensive. I also appreciated kind of learning how to do video editing. I think that's become more and more of an important tool. And now you can do it by swiping on your phone with iMovie, which is like mind blowing. I learned on Adobe Premiere, it's like a really big program. And then I stick with a couple core social media platforms for the brand, and also personally. So Facebook, still around, still huge. So kind of has to be maintained and still can drive traffic. And each platform has a different purpose, so Twitter, more for journalists and that kind of interaction. And then Instagram has a totally different demographic than both of these. And we reach a different market through that. So Those are the main platforms I'm still sticking with. So again, not TikTok for me yet.
And Nick?
Those are all great. I would say, if Creative Suite is too overwhelming for any of you, you can also try Sketch, Figma. These are some new, they're comparable to Illustrator, I guess. I think Figma even has a free tier, so it's really easy to get started there. But I completely agree with Michelle. You want to be able to, the expectation these days is that you can be a one-person band. Not just write, but also, hey, do the graphics for this, maybe put together the video. Final Cut Pro has a free trial now on Mac, so that's great. What other tools? Well, this might be a little bit beyond, but Vox has a really great CMS. They demoed their editor mode, and I was blown away. It's like Google Docs meets traditional CMS editor.
That Chorus?
Yes, yeah,
okay.
Chorus, yeah. And for social media, Buffer is pretty convenient. You can post to multiple platforms simultaneously, schedule the posts, so that's nice. And to Michelle's point, they each have a different demographic. They each also have a very different product experience. Instagram being much more visual. So we're all users of these platforms, but sometimes it requires you to take a step back and actually reflect on how you personally use those platforms differently, and then apply those points of view to how you grow your brand on those different platforms.
Speaking of, oh, go ahead, Michelle.
I think you never really know the skills that you learn, like where they're going to pop up again later. And one of the things during this pandemic was Columbia Architecture School, where I work and teach, hired us to make podcasts for them. And I've always wanted to do a podcast, but never had the time and bandwidth. But knowing video editing made podcast editing like so much faster. And so I just did it all in GarageBand, which is on every Mac. Learned some new tools during this pandemic.
Yeah, it's a great period for trying new things and learning new things. I want to ask you about your personal brands. We alluded to this earlier. We're all we've got a public face, and then we've got our own side projects and our own personal brands on social media and elsewhere. I want to just ask you how you think about managing that. Nick, as a CEO, you're in the spotlight as the face of your company in a way, but you also have personal interests and creative interests, I'm sure. How do you manage that? And Michelle, you also have, a personal side as well as your kind of CEO or founder side. How do you balance those two things and keep them both active and enjoy both of them? Nick, you want to start?
Yeah. Boy, I probably need to figure out the answer first. This is something I probably need to work on. I mean, look, my company's still quite small. It's a team of 14. Our impact is, I can see the boundaries of our impact. Let's put it that way. So I don't feel too exposed. I'm very transparent in my social media. Nothing's locked, nothing, I don't really have too much of a filter. I've always felt a little uncomfortable, to be honest, about building a personal brand on Twitter, though. Maybe it's my Asian upbringing, but I just always think my own thoughts aren't good enough. Whereas, Twitter seems to be, whatever's on your mind in that hour, you post, and that's just not in me. So I have difficulty there, but Instagram I find to be much more natural. Since it's so visual, and I'm just sharing what I'm seeing through my eyes. I mean, I think ask me in a couple of years, and maybe it'll be different.
Michelle, how do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, I always felt like I didn't have enough time to build my own personal branding as much as I would have liked. The focus was all like, I need to grow the followers of Untapped New York, But I would say one of the fun things I've discovered in this pandemic was I started posting on my Twitter kind of more personal stuff, not like deep thoughts, but like, here's me bringing back my cello. I was trained at Juilliard, so it's like I brought it back to like play some for my daughter, and everyone loved like Charlotte, who's 2.5, like running in and saying things. I discovered that people really like that. So it's been kind of fun interacting. I used to just really post professional links and stories that I had written. And so I didn't really think Twitter was a place for that. I just thought it was for like political thoughts or, and so that was a fun discovery that I've been trying to keep up. But at the same time, you have to keep your sanity. So like this past week, I've been feeling like the Twitter feed is just like driving me crazy. I was trying to figure out why I was feeling like anxiety. But apart from living in the suburbs in my parents' house for the last month, is I think it's my Twitter feed. And so like sometimes I have to take a break from it. And then Instagram, I also treat as a kind of personal, it's open and to the public, but I think of it as I think mostly my friends are my followers there. So yeah, it's a hard thing to build everything all at once. I feel like our followers on Untapped now are pretty robust, so I can kind of think a bit more about what my personal brand is.
So we're getting to the closeout, sort of wrap up here. I want to give you each a chance to share a final thought, and there's actually a question about new graduates entering the pool in terms of adding to your own team. Is this in this case? But maybe we can broaden that to people thinking about starting their own newsletter or podcast, et cetera. You've kind of provided some advice along the way, but any additional final thoughts or anything you want to add, or something that might be a little bit counterintuitive or unexpected that people might not hear often that you want to share, or whatever other final thought. Michelle, do you want to start?
Yeah, we're a small team too. We have 4 or 5 in our office, which we don't have anymore. We happily gave that up. But, and then we have about 30 freelance tour guides. But in terms of the people that I have hired on the journalism and in office end, I've only hired people that have worked for me before. I feel like this kind of new world of journalism, it requires having experience like in that space, to use WordPress effectively and fast, to do social media for your posts, and to have that kind of 360 about like, it's not just the writing of an article, it's like, how do I promote it? How do I make it visually compelling, to know all of that? And so it's really hard for me to see on a resume whether they're going to be good at any of that, how fast they're going to be at writing something. And then I also look for people that have a really wide range of abilities and skills. So when you're a small company, you have to, this girl I might have hired for writing now needs to run our membership program. That's actually exactly what happened. I hired her first as an editorial intern, and then she was writing things for us. And then we said, why don't you like take the lead and program our events and be the point person for our insiders program. And she did a great job with that, because we already kind of knew that she was very adaptable. And then she discovered that she loved that. So that's important to me, adaptability. And I always had a dream that like in a large company that I could run, that I would say for 6 months, if you're bored of what you're doing, you could actually go to this other department and do that for 6 months. I would have loved that when I worked in the corporate world. And so I look for that now in terms of how I run my team, but also what tasks I give them. Like right now, I'd actually really love to stop writing and do something completely different for 2 months or something. We'll see.
Great, thank you. Nick?
I would say if you're even thinking a little bit about starting a newsletter or even launching a website, do it. And now is maybe the best time ever. What else can you do? Right? It's really hard to job hunt right now, especially if you're looking at newsrooms. And not just the pandemic, as we all know, they've got their struggles right now. But if you are able to show that you can build an audience from scratch, and like what Michelle's looking for, that you're able to use all these multimedia tools to produce all this content yourself, boy, that's probably the best thing you could put on a CV. That if your project doesn't turn into a business itself, at the very least, it will land you an amazing job once this is all over.
Great. Thank you both so much for joining today. I think there's a lot of rich insights in what you've shared, and I think people will be well served by following you going forward, following Pico, following Untapped Cities, Untapped New York, and you individually as 2 individuals, as we discussed. This is the last, as I mentioned earlier, this is the last in our current series of these Let's Talk Media Business events, but we're planning to reconvene once people have had their summer breaks, whatever that means this summer, in the fall again. And I'll just mention, for those who don't know, we are launching a 100-day program for journalism creators who are creating the kinds of products and services we've been talking about: newsletters, podcasts, websites, niche event series, all sorts of different kinds of things. And we want to help give people momentum in that process. And we're really excited about that. It's launching in January, and the applications will open August 31st. So if you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to me or anyone at the J School and ask us about it. We're going to have some sessions over the rest of the summer and in the fall about that as well. And we'd love to hear from you. And we'd love to see what you're working on and what you're building, because there's so much exciting new stuff that's out there, as both of these guests have talked about. I posted something about some tips from last week's guests, and since there's been so many interesting ideas, I think I'm going to try to do that again this week. So if that's of interest, I just posted the link in the chat, and there's also some links you've probably seen for more info about our program as well. So yeah, with that, thank you again, Nick and Michelle, and thanks to everyone for being part of this today. And have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Thanks.